So Viltrox has released this new 35mm f1.7 air lens, and the air in the name is actually true. Any lens that can make my 23mm f2 lens from Fujifilm feel heavy can have the air in its name, in my opinion. Viltrox was kind enough to send me this lens for review, but of course that doesn't influence my opinion and what I tell you about it in this review, and they will see the review for the first time at the same time you do as well. So I've used this lens for around 2 months now, most recently on a trip to Spain where I used it for landscape photography, but also normal travel photography. As we flew with a certain airline who shall not be named, I didn't take my big photography backpack as my hand luggage, only my sling bag with my X-T4 and 2 prime lenses, the 23 from Fujifilm and the 35mm from Viltrox. We stayed in a small mountain village called Comades, which is 700 meters above sea level, so only taking 2 prime lenses kind of turned out to be a mistake, but I think I made the best of it. I usually like shooting on the telephoto side of things, especially landscapes, but of course if you have a prime lens you have to work with the focal length you have on you. Real quick, some info about this lens. It has auto and manual focus, an aperture that goes from f1.7 to f16. It has a minimum focusing distance of 33 centimeters and it weighs only 170 grams. It's available for the Fujifilm X mount, the sonyE mount and the nikonZ mount, and it costs $179 or 199 euros. And honestly, this small 35mm prime lens really surprised me, so here's what I liked about this lens. The image quality of this small and light lens is actually amazing. Like, I'm not one to zoom in 200% on a picture. I'm actually usually the opposite. I usually decrease my clarity because I like this somewhat dreamy look on my pictures. But I could see a visible difference between my 23mm f2 prime and this 35 1.7 from Viltrox, which, you know, can be expected because the release date of these two lenses are 8 years apart. Another thing that really surprised me about this lens is the build quality, because when you hear that a lens only weighs 170 grams, you might think it would be somewhat flimsy. But really, it doesn't feel cheap. Of course, it's mostly made out of plastic to keep the weight down. The lens mount is made out of metal though, as the part with the most friction should be. And in the lens mount, it also has a small USB-C port to download the newest firmware. So about the plastic that it's made of, it's kind of a soft touch plastic, I think it's the best way to describe it, but it doesn't feel cheap, like it doesn't wiggle around, it feels very sturdy. Now, two pieces that are often overlooked in the lens are the sun hood and the lens cap. Before receiving this lens, I looked up a couple of reviews about other Viltrox lenses online, and often I heard that the sun hood is kind of overlooked by them and it's just not a part they pay too much attention to. So that was definitely something I was gonna check out with this lens. And I have to say, it seems like they have heard these comments and complaints because they have definitely improved in this department. The sun hood on this lens feels really sturdy, is I think made of the same plastic material that the lens is, and it's actually more secure than most of the sun hoods on my Fujifilm lenses. Also, something that I've not really heard about these lenses from other people yet, but something that kind of bugs me sometimes, so I just want to put it out there. I can really appreciate a good lens cap. You probably know this feeling when you're shooting something, then you're just taking a break for a minute and you put your lens cap back on and it just doesn't hold in place properly, it falls off. Sometimes with some lenses it's really hard to put in place properly. I think Fujifilm does it great, some third-party lenses don't, but I have to say I don't have experience with previous Viltrox lens caps, but this one on this lens is really good. Now, of course, there are also parts that I didn't like so much, so let's get into those now. So you have to know that this lens doesn't have an aperture ring, which, if you think about it, that's a Sony, Nikon and Fujifilm lens, might not be a big deal to the Nikon and Sony users. Actually, don't know, I think most Sony Nikon lenses don't have that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but for Fujifilm shooters, I think it can be a big deal because I'm used to changing my aperture on the lens and not with a dial, and it's kind of unintuitive. I had to remind myself all the time because I would always try to change the aperture on the lens when shooting. But of course, when you buy a lens like this, you know previous to buying that it doesn't have an aperture ring. Also, it doesn't have weather sealing, which I guess is a question of price and weight probably, but just something you have to be aware of. If you don't have a weather sealed camera, it's probably not a big deal, but if you have a weather sealed camera, you usually want to take out your lenses in the elements as well. And I have to say, I did take this Viltrox lens out with my Fujifilm X-T4, which is weather sealed, the lens is not. It was just light rain and it worked fine, it was not a problem, but of course, not having weather sealing, you don't have a guarantee that it's gonna work after you bring it back home. Now, one more thing I realized, while the autofocus is very reliable, it's not the fastest. It's not horrendously slow or anything, but there is a visible difference between this autofocus and, for example, the linear motor autofocus on Fujifilm lenses. For my use case, the speed of the autofocus is completely irrelevant as long as it locks onto the target reliably, and that it does. But if you were to hypothetically shoot fast-moving subjects like in sports, this lens might not be quick enough for your taste. However, I have to admit this might just be because I have a pre-production model of this lens, so it might be fixed on release or maybe with a firmware after. Now, if you are interested in getting this lens, Viltrox was kind enough to give me a 15% discount code, which I put for you in the description below. Just for full transparency, if you are getting this lens with this discount code, I'm also getting small commission, just for you to know. This discount offer is valid from December 18th to December 30th. After this time, you will still be able to get a discount, but only 8% if you put my code LUKASBENJAMIN, which I also put for you in the description below. Now, who do I think this lens is for? If you have a small camera that's not weather sealed anyway, and you want a compact and lightweight prime lens, this lens might just be the right one for you, because you can just take it anywhere and you really won't even feel it. Also, for people that just want to test out the 35mm focal length, you really can't go wrong with this lens. It has really good image quality. I was really surprised by that, and it only costs 200 euros. And even if you're not going to use it all the time, you can just put it in your bag and really you won't feel it because it's only 170 grams. Now, if you are curious with which new Fujifilm X camera you compare this lens, check out this video right here.